I'm joined now by Benjamin Anthony. He's an IDF combat reservist and a veteran of several IDF campaigns. He's also the co-founder and CEO of the Miriam Institute, which describes itself as the premier international forum for Israel-focused discussion. He joins us tonight from Washington, D.C. Mr. Anthony, it's good to have you on the program. The U.S. President.
Thank you for having me.
The U.S. President and the Secretary of State, they have exerted a lot of public pressure recently to get Israel to say yes to these daily pauses in the fighting in Gaza. The concerns coming from Israel's allies, are they impacting the effectiveness of the military's campaign in Gaza?
No, I don't think so at all. And I think that it's positive that the State of Israel has moved towards what it calls tactical pauses in the fighting. It's positive because it means that we're making very good progress there militarily. It's also positive because under no circumstances is Prime Minister Netanyahu willing to enter into a long-term ceasefire with Hamas, despite Hamas's pleas for Israel to do so and requests for Israel to do so. And the Prime Minister has reiterated and stood firm behind the goals of this war, which are to topple Hamas and to have the hostages returned home to our people inside the State of Israel safely and whole. And therefore, the humanitarian pauses can take place. But if there is to be a ceasefire, the Prime Minister is very clear, the hostages must come home.
Let me ask you about targets. The IDF says that its targets are chosen for military reasons and that they are in line with international law. But above that, to what extent does the moral dilemma caused by the death of civilians in these engagements, to what extent does that put these strategic goals in jeopardy?
Well, actually, the IDF's activities inside the Gaza Strip supersede the standard imposed by international humanitarian law. I'll give you an example. The dropping of leaflets and the reiterated calls for the Gazans to evacuate south by way of a humanitarian corridor that's facilitated by the Israel Defense Forces, that actually supersedes the requirement of militaries in armed conflict. That's actually a standard that the IDF employs as a consequence of our moral standard being higher than the legal threshold. So that's just one point with regard to that. And in terms of the targeting, it's absolutely proportionate to the goals of the war. Once we saw the rampage on October the 7th of Hamas, which resulted in the murder of 1,400 of our people, our elderly, our infirm, our women, our children, our unborn children, and the kidnapping of some 230 hostages, 240 hostages into the Gaza Strip, including Holocaust survivors and all of those categories of people that I mentioned earlier, the war goal became the toppling of Hamas. Because of that, it is proportionate to make more direct, more key, more impactful strikes if they are in service of that war aim. So I'm very comfortable with the proportionality of the IDF's activities.
Israeli soldiers, as I'm sure you're aware, are dying in this war that was started by Hamas. But it's also a war that was caused by a failure to provide security. And political parties which have turned out, political policies which have turned out to be flawed. Military leaders in Israel, they have admitted their responsibility. Are you happy with the response that you've seen from Israel's political leadership?
I'll be perfectly frank with you. I'm speaking here as an individual, as a citizen of the State of Israel, as a combat veteran of service in the Israel Defense Forces. I'm not happy with the fact that the Prime Minister is yet to say very, very clearly and unequivocally that he bears responsibility for what occurred during October the 7th. Now, let me be clear. The doing of what occurred on October 7th is not Prime Minister Netanyahu's. That is the doing of Hamas, this terrorist organization that we must now destroy. The responsibility for what took place, of course, that has to rest at the head of state, that being Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I'm very hopeful that he will actually come out and make that statement, because it's a statement of leadership. If one accepts upon their shoulders clear responsibility for something as heinous and horrific as this is, I think that the community there in the State of Israel, that our people in Israel will understand that there is a leader cognizant of everything that took place and willing to shoulder the burden of responsibility, however heavy that may be.
Yeah, what you're saying there is words matter. Optics are also important, especially in war. Are you aware of any cabinet member attending the funeral of a fallen Israeli soldier in this war?
So I'm aware of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is the only individual that I know of who has attended funerals. Now, this is obviously something that needs to be remedied and improved upon. It's unfortunately a basic standard, and it's de rigueur that cabinet ministers, prime ministers, and so forth will attend the funerals of the fallen in the state of Israel in the event of a loss. The fact that that's not taking place is deeply regrettable, but I do want your viewers to stay very clearly focused on what brought about this circumstance that we now debate, the virtues or demerits of people visiting the funerals of those who've been killed. What's at play here is the most murderous rampage against the Jewish people since the events of the Holocaust. Nothing short of that. What's important to note is that it's not the same Jews that were there during the Holocaust. These Jews in the states of Israel are able to fight. They're able to defend themselves, and I believe they're more than capable of bringing about the toppling and destruction of Hamas.
Israel started this war politically divided. Case in point, judicial reform. Last night, I interviewed Uriel Abulof, a political science professor at Tel Aviv University, and he told me that Israeli society is united only in its opposition to Hamas. The polarizing politics of Netanyahu, he said, they remain. Do you agree with that statement? And who do you see being a future bridge builder inside Israel?
So I don't know the professor that you mentioned. I'm not familiar with his work or his opinions. I do believe that Israel, unfortunately, unnecessarily came to this war at a period of deep disunity within our society and among our citizenry. That's very regrettable and lamentable, and the role that that played in this failure that you announced at the top of this interview, that will be investigated thoroughly, absolutely thoroughly. Now, what you have at the moment is you have very clear and declared unity among the forces of the Israel Defense Forces, among the security establishment. And you also have a unity government that's come to play that includes members of the coalition of Prime Minister Netanyahu and members of the opposition, most notably Minister Benny Gantz, who has stepped into a central role in the war cabinet. So you do have that unity. It's positive to see, but one has to understand the disunity that predated this war. That was over something that was less than vital, in my opinion. It's only my opinion, but that is my view. Now, you have something that's absolutely vital to the cohesion of Israel at play right now. Number one, you have more than 200 of our hostages inside the Gaza Strip. You also have more than 1,400 members of our society who have been murdered. The relatives and families of both of those groups, they are going to let their voices be heard, and they will start to become increasingly outspoken in their demands for answers as to how this could take place and how, in the case of the hostages, this can be remedied.
I want to ask you, Mr. Anthony, for your thoughts on a quote from the late Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon from 2004, when he was quoted as saying, by the end of 2005, there will not be a single Jew left in the Gaza Strip. I mean, that was almost 20 years ago. But when you think about what's happening right now, how does that quote from an Israeli leader, how does that sit with you now, considering what is happening?
Well, I personally think that the ceding of land is a mistaken thought. It's a mistaken aspect of political philosophy. It's not a process that works. The idea of ceding land for peace has not borne fruit when it comes to negotiations with the Palestinian Arabs. We gave land, we withdrew entirely in 2005, as you alluded to with that quote from former Prime Minister Sharon. We withdrew entirely from the Gaza Strip by way of the disengagement in 2005. There indeed was no Jewish presence there inside the Gaza Strip. There was an opportunity for the Palestinian Arabs to develop and to build upon the Gaza Strip, to create an oasis, nothing short of that, along the shoreline of the Mediterranean. They instead chose terrorism, and they proceeded to build rocket launching factories. They proceeded to arm up. They proceeded to launch horrific terror attacks, the worst of which we've just seen on October 7th against the one and only Jewish state, targeting our citizens and targeting our civilians. And I think that what you will probably see is that October 7th marks the death knell not only for Hamas as a movement, as I said, it must be destroyed militarily, it must be completely vanquished from the face of the earth, nothing short of that. But you've probably also seen the death knell of the two-state solution. I do not